Thank you, and good morning, everybody from Geneva. Well, I'm going to do a quick presentation on health-related IP provisions in RTA. This is part of our regular work in my division, the Intellectual Property Division, where, we get a lot of requests about, can you please help us see what's going on with the RTA? So it has become like a way of measuring temperature on the evolution of IP regimes around the world. So while the WTO does not provide advice on how to negotiate the regional trade agreements, what we do is actually we keep an eye on what's going on. And we study it, and we try to help our members as much as possible. This graph has been taken from the second edition of the trilateral study that we prepared with our colleagues from WHO and WIPO. And I personally love it, and I think it's very relevant to the topic of this morning, because it shows you the interaction of public health, IP, and trade, and how these spheres work together to deliver innovation and access to medical technologies. The pandemic has shown us how we rely on trade to move inputs and finished products from one country to another. Also, it has shown us, as the previous speakers highlighted, the importance of keeping trade lines open, the importance of regulatory cooperation, and that you can see it here. So in my case, we're going to speak more about the yellow sphere that you see there. So our work in my division is about mapping IP provisions in regional trade agreements. According to our latest version of the database, 76% of the FTAs that are in force and have been notified to the WTO do include IP provisions. That 24% that you see in green is formed basically by very old agreements. I'm talking 40, 50 years old agreements. IP provisions in FTAs can be categorized in these three big groups. The general IP provisions, for example, commitment to protect intellectual property, reaffirmation of the TRIPS agreement, enforcement, exhaustion, etc. We have the specific IPR provisions, for example, the protection periods for copyrights, for industrial designs, for patents. Lately, we have also seen provisions about protection of satellite signals, about domain names, and also about the protection of genetic resources. And then, of course, what's our interest this morning, health-related IP provisions. And we have a very colorful map of provisions, and we have to always remember that RTAs will cover all sectors of technology, not only health technologies, but there are certain provisions like patentability criteria that are directly linked to health technologies. Also, we have patent term extensions that are mentioned in the chapter on intellectual property and compulsory licenses, which are very relevant. I would like to give you a real example, and I really like the chapter because it dealt with one of my pet subjects, test data protection. And I have Peru. It's halfway around the world from Bangkok and from where most of you are based. And Peru has a lasagna of international obligations on data protection. I'm sure everybody has heard about the famous spaghetti bowl in free trade agreements. Well, I took it up a notch. Now it's a lasagna. So we have the Andean Community Decision 486. This is a decision that applies to all the members of the Andean Community. It dates back to the year 2000. The TRIPS agreement that entered into force also in the year 2000 for Peru. We have the FTA with the US, the FTA with the European Free Trade Association, the association agreement with the European Union, and you know very well the CPTPP. All the links that you see in my presentation are active. You should get a copy of my presentation so you can look at them anytime. So this is very interesting because all these legal instruments had something to say about data protection. So what did the Peruvians do? After the negotiation of the FTA with the US, there was a lot of discussion around the protection of data protection. So what did they do? First, they went and defined test data. If you look at any of these legal instruments, there's not a you will not find a definition of test data protection. Then they also went and defined new chemical entity. That is very important. When you are talking about patents and when you're talking about regulatory procedures for new medicines. And then they went really into detail about the period of protection that will be granted to test data regarding new chemical entities. The paper by Maritza Reategui is available on that website, and I invite you to read it. There is an English translation, the original is in Spanish, but it's a very nice paper and she explains everything very, very well. She's not only a lawyer, but she's also a pharmacist. So she has both sides of the coin. When it comes to the amended TRIPS agreement, one of my favorite phrases is that it is the first time that an agreement is amended because of public health concerns. If we look back at the history and we remember the HIV/AIDS crisis back in the year 2000, and we read about the history, we see how the African group brought this issue, members took it in, and yes, it took a couple of years to get to the waiver, but there was a reaction of the system which was unprecedented at that point in time. The result is Article 31 bis, which you read extensively about in the chapter. And what does it do? It creates a new legal avenue to export pharmaceutical products that were produced under compulsory license. And the main objective here is to help those countries that do not have the capacity to produce those pharmaceutical products. And I'm talking here about complicated products like antiretrovirals or, for example, a new antibiotic or even maybe a vaccine. The only requirement that you will find there is the notification to the TRIPS Council. It's a one-page notification. You will see it in my next slide. And we have all the templates available. The system has formally only been used once when Rwanda purchased some antiretrovirals from Canada. And this is what you will always read in the press, how it has only been used once in the last 17 years. Well, I'm a fan of Ellen Tijon. She's a fantastic woman who knows everything there is to know about IP and health. And she wrote this study for WHO in 2017. And actually her finding is that TRIPS flexibilities have been used more frequently than is commonly assumed and have proven effective for procuring generic versions of essential medicines, particularly for treating HIV infection. The system has been utilized in negotiations with providers. This is also confirmed by some anecdotal evidence. You can find the articles online, particularly from Brazil. The Brazilians have been quite crafty, I would say, in using the idea of invoking the flexibilities in negotiations on prices with their with the companies that produce and provide them with medicines. So this is my latest work of art. This is the notification from Bolivia that was submitted in May to the TRIPS Council, where Bolivia says that it needs 15 million of doses of COVID vaccines. You don't see the brand there, but they are actually referring to the monodose Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Why? Because in a developing country like Bolivia, they think it's more practical to have just a one-dose vaccine. So this is what we did. It's a one-page document that goes out to the world. And what is it, in essence? Is Bolivia saying, hello, I'm open for business. I need this vaccine, which I cannot produce. The WTO nor its members required any other documentation saying or proving that they don't have the capacity. Today, we can, I think it's very easy to know which countries can produce these sort of vaccines and which cannot. It's not a plant that you set up in 2 days, or the people that you need to work there. Also, if you look at the 1, 2, 3, 4th row, you see that Bolivia wasn't sure at that point in time whether they had already some patents related to the vaccine. So they had the opportunity to put that this was to be determined, and if there were any patent in force in the territory of Bolivia, then they would issue the compulsory license that goes with it. This document is available by clicking on the link. So the key here, and because you always hear this, and I'm sorry, Professor, because I always hear this quote about the cumbersome, and sometimes I say like, it's very easy. I did this notification like this by Teams with the Bolivian delegate and with a Bolivian official in capital in La Paz, and we did it in less than 30 minutes. Well, we did it in Spanish too. This is the translation that I'm showing you. So I'm like, okay, you see, this is pretty easy. Even the guy from Capital said, like, well, Josefita, that's it. And like, that's it. You click send, and that's it. So what is going on? And over time, what we have found is that what is really difficult is the actual national implementation. When you read the WTO agreements, and you will excuse me, I come from Latin America, we like everything in black and white. We like the details. We want to know what to do, what not to do. That's why I fell in love with the Anglo-Saxon style of doing things. Having a text that allows you to move and to adjust, and that's the beauty about international law. But then the problem is when you go home, how do you implement? And we have been doing some digging too, and we found until last summer that in at least 56 members and 1 observer, there was some kind of implementing measures for the amended TRIPS agreement. That is not too much. If we think the WTO has 164 members. So if we're only talking about 56, the number is quite low. Most of them are industrialized country members. 3 of them were transition countries, that means from the former Soviet Union. 13 developing countries, and 3 LDCs that included Samoa, a very recent member of the WTO. But what is interesting is that this covers more than 85% of the world's export markets of pharmaceuticals. And there's more details on the working paper that was prepared back in 2015, which we are working on. And maybe next year, if you invite me, I will be happy to present that. So some food for thought for you guys. If you are going to negotiate a new agreement, and I want you to think, how am I going to implement these provisions when I come back home? How am I going to do that? What do I need to implement key features into national law. And this applies to everything you negotiate internationally. What is the most straightforward measure? And how would be the authority delegated for efficient decision-making? This is incredibly important. I cannot name my customers, but I've been in, well, when I used to do missions, I went to a couple of countries and went through their implementing legislation, and actually there was no delegation of authority. So who is taking the decisions? Who says it's a national health emergency? When we have a global pandemic, well, that's very easy. But when you have something localized in a region, who does that? It is very interesting to see the particularities of different countries. So how can you integrate the system as a tool in the procurement process? And this is something that we have spoken about very recently in many activities related to COVID-19. Yes, you would like to buy the vaccines. You need to buy the freezers to keep the vaccines. You need to buy the ancillary products such as the syringes or the cotton or the alcohol. How do you include all this into a procurement process? Also, what are the other members doing? Who has been successful? Look at the Brazilians, for example. Look at the Peruvians. Maybe they don't use the system all the way through as Rwanda and Canada did, but they are using it up to a certain stage. Also, it's very important for everyone. Please notify any measures. This helps everyone. It's transparency. It helps also the professors when they do the research, when they have a reliable source of information in the notifications. That's why transparency is so important across the board. So I will not go into details about the waiver proposal because this is still under discussion by members, and you know very well we in the Secretariat, we let the members discuss and come to an agreement. If you want to read the latest, please go to the report from the meeting that took place a couple of weeks ago. Everything is there. Also, when it comes to TRIPS-related measures, we have been compiling a list of non-exhaustive list of measures. It is interesting to see that 3/4 are administrative measures. And I take from the presentation from Jan the importance of going online and streamlining procedures. I think this is one of the greatest opportunities of the pandemic. We got to evolve quite quickly. So we need to see what is good, what we should keep, even when COVID is over, hopefully, and what should be improved still. This is something very important. And in IP, where there's a lot of national procedures and fees, you see how countries have streamlined and have made everything easier for the user. Also, 1/4 of those measures are substantive, and that meant that there was the need to issue a decree or to amend a certain law. Some of them were notified to the TRIPS Council, and it's very interesting to see the different paths that have been taken by different countries. I put here some links on COVID-related information that you may access, and I would like to give you with some food for thought. Taken from the Handbook of Deep Trade Agreements, we have that deep trade agreements that have the objective of regulatory convergence. You see that IP protection is very important for innovation and the business environment. We could consider if there's a potential for duplication and overlap, and keep this in our minds when we are thinking about new provisions, about new agreements. There's a need for a coherent and practical approach, both in negotiations and implementation. And then there's always the consideration about IP in global value chains. And of course, once again, my my commercial about the trilateral study. Please look at it. So I love gymnastics, and you know, this was brilliant. I don't know if you saw that routine, but I want to leave you with this. The balance of rights and obligations is a dynamic equilibrium that is always moving. We need to always be moving and learning. It's like the gymnast here, Wang Chen. If she stops moving, she will fall from the beam. And we are all standing on the beam, and on top the beam moves a little bit, so we need to always be trying to keep our balance. So how can the international system respond and find practical solutions for different countries with different legal traditions, with different levels of development? So this is what I want to leave you with. We need to be always thinking about the future and about preserving this dynamic equilibrium. So thank you very much.